Today we're going to be learning Sukkah Daf Yud Aleph. This is the Daf for Tisha B'Av. I just want to point out, as I mentioned in the previous class, but I'll clarify a little bit better, which is that learning on Tisha B'Av is a custom not to do it, not to learn on Tisha B'Av, only things that are specifically related to the destruction, sad Gemaras, so to speak. The idea is that learning Gemara adds a certain element of happiness and enjoyment, and that is something that we're not supposed to experience, that type of enjoyment on Tisha B'Av. So therefore, it's recommended to learn this daf either before Tisha B'Av or after Tisha B'Av. Okay, with that, we're going to get started. We ended yesterday's daf with a line about, right, I'm just thinking about how, right, the reason a lot of us are doing this is because of the enjoyment of learning Gemara. So it's nice, and it's, even though you say, oh no, it's a little bit annoying, we won't be able to learn Tisha B'Av, but think about that concept of how much we enjoy our learning. Okay, so we had this statement of Rav Shmuel, of Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel. The first version of it was, Mutar lishon b'kila b'sukkah, you can sleep in a kila inside a sukkah, af al pi sheyesh lagag, even though it has a roof. Right? Remember, kila could be either with a roof or it could be slanted down, so without any real roof. This one, according to the first version of Shmuel, he was talking about one that had a roof, and it was not gavoa asara, it wasn't 10 tefachim high. Then we got off on another topic about someone saying a bracha when he's in this kila and his head is outside and he's not wearing any clothing. The kila can function as a covering, as like a covering of your body, as long as it's not 10 tefachim high. We said because once it's 10 tefachim high, it's like a house. So here the Gemara comments and says, but by it nami, a house also alpha pisha ein gavoa asara. It was one difference between a house and this kila, though. This kila is functioning like a house, which means once it's 10 tefachim tall, you can't say this is like a clothing and it's covering my body, and I can then have my head outside and say a bracha or say kriyat shema, because it's not, it's because it's like a house, but it's not exactly like a house, because a house, even though it's not 10 tefachim high, kevan dikvia olahu, a house doesn't need to be 10 tefachim high for it not to function in this manner, meaning you can't use a house as your clothing, because a house is not clothing. House is delogara mikinofot, right? It's no worse than kinofot, which is this canopy bed, which we said was more serious, right? It was kavua. And even if it's less than 10 tefachim, we're going to consider this a tent. So obviously a house will be that way. And that's different from this kila, which we're going to call the kila, depends on whether once it's 10 tefachim, it'll already be like a house. And a house wouldn't actually need those 10 tefachim to be called a house. Right? It's like anything. It's about your use, what you call it. It's called a house, that's already a house. That means you can't use it as clothing. A kila could function as that if it's not tall enough. Lishna Achrina. Now we get to a second version of Rav Shmuel and Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel. Amrele, some people say, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Mutar lishon b'kilat chatanim. He wasn't talking about a regular kila, he was talking about a kilat chatanim. Now there's different descriptions, there's different explanations about what exactly kilat chatanim is. Let me actually try to pull up the pictures. This will help us. There's two different opinions about what exactly kilat chatanim is. There's Rashi, and then there's others. I just want to pull it up. So while I'm doing it, I'll continue to read. If you have this kilat chatanim, second, to get to it on my computer, I should have opened it earlier. So if you have a kilat chatanim, second. Nothing like pictures. Oh no, there's no pictures here. I thought there were pictures. Okay, back to square one. No pictures. So there's pictures in the Koran. I don't have them in front of me. Okay, so I'll just try to describe it in words. I assume the picture book had these, but I see now they don't. So you can either have a kilat chatanim, which is the way we had it before, like a naklitin, where it has two boards, one on the head and one on the foot, and then there's a board connecting them, and then you have this upside down V shape of covering. Okay, some people say it doesn't even have the boards. It just has somehow a board going up. There's this upside down V. Another option is Rashi, who says, Eina kishar kila ve'eno sim lagag. Either which way, we want to get to something that doesn't have a roof. With the way they understand Rashi is it has like it goes, there's poles at the top, and the cloth kind of goes from pole to pole, but it doesn't actually create a roof. Okay, each board is very narrow, and then it goes from one to the other and it loops down. Okay, so either which way, we have something that doesn't really have a roof. So he says you can sleep there on Sukkot inside your sukkah. It doesn't have a roof. We don't care if it's 10 tefachim tall, as long as its height is less than because it doesn't have a roof. Even if its height is more than 10, it's not considered a problem, and therefore you can sleep there. So again, in the first version, right, Shmuel said that we were talking about a kila, and he said the kila has a roof, and as long as it's less than 10, this doesn't have a roof, and therefore we don't care if it's more than 10. Meitive. Question though. It says in the following source, we're going to again have a slew of questions, mostly from the same sources we had on the first version. You can't sleep in a kila. So how do you explain that? And according to Shmuel, who said you can't sleep in this kila. That was a kila that has a gag. That's why you can't. Okay, but this you can. And if you see, I charted out Rav Yehuda according to Shmuel in the first version. And then I charted out Rav Yehuda according to Shmuel in the second version. And not only that, but all the questions. And it's Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, and Shmuel only spoke about the kilat chatanim. The question is, what would he say in these other cases? And that's what the Gemara is going to try to explain. So it's not him himself, but I put there all the different options as to what we say with the kila, what we say with naklitim, what we say with the kinofot. So we now say, according to this, a kila, so a kilat chatanim, it doesn't matter the height. A kila, and you can, no matter what, you can be yotze because it has no roof. The kila has a roof. Because it has a roof, it's a problem. What's not clear here, and that's why I put a question mark, is it only a problem at 10 tefachim high, like in the previous one, or is it even a problem less than 10 tefachim? So that's not clear from this lashon of Shmuel. Tashma, next source, naklitin shnayim. This is again the two bed boards that end up with a V-shaped covering over your bed. Kinofot arba'a. Kinofot is when you have 4 poles and then you have a roof over, like a canopy bed. Peres al gabe kinofot psula al gabe naklitin shera. This is the exact same source we quoted at the end of yesterday. If you put a cloth over the kinofot, it will be disqualified because you have a roof over you. Al gabe naklitin shera u'bavad shelo yu naklitin gvohim namita sarat tvachim. However, it has to be less than 10. Ha gvohim namita sarat psula. It sounds from here that if the naklitin were, even though it doesn't have a roof, it were higher than 10, it would be a problem. Even though it doesn't have a roof, that seems to contradict what Shmuel just said, which is, again, assuming, now, even if either the canopy bed is just like the naklitin, or it's a little bit different and it's got some other kind of thing, but either which way, it doesn't have a roof. And it seems like it doesn't matter if it's 10 tefachim high, it's still okay. So, and here it says it has to be less than 10 tefachim. So what are the answer? Shane naklitin dikviye. Naklitin are solid in the bed. They're part of the bed. But this kilat chatanim is something temporary. By the way, I didn't say this. Kilat chatanim is something they used. It was a wedding canopy. It was some sort of canopy they used for a wedding. And therefore, it was something temporary. They would build it for the wedding and then they would undo it. Whereas the naklitin are permanent in your bed. So then they said, wait a minute. Permanent, what did we say about permanent before? Then it should be like kinofot, and even less than 10, it should be a problem because that was what we said by kinofot. Even less than 10, it's a problem because they're always there in the bed. So what are the answer? It's all relative. Legabe kinofot lo kvi, legabe kila kvi. When it, right, relating to kinofot, well, it's less permanent than kinofot, but it's more permanent compared to this kilat chatanim. So we end up with this in between, and that's why it's going to depend on the height. Whereas the kilat chatanim doesn't depend on the height, no matter what it's allowed. The kinofot doesn't depend on the height, no matter what it's a problem. And the naklitin is exactly in the middle. Now we're going to have a different opinion that actually disagrees with Shmuel's first opinion, because this isn't talking about kilat chatanim, it's talking about a regular kila. Rabba bar Rav Huna, Darash Rabba bar Rav Huna, he taught mutar lishon b'kila, af al pi sheyesh lagag. You can sleep in a kila even though it has a roof, exactly what Shmuel said before, but He says, even if it's 10 high. Shmuel had said, as long as it's not 10 tall. He says, even if it is 10 tall, Kiman, who does this go according to? Aren't you really, if it's 10 tachim tall, it's like a tent. How could you possibly sleep in there? Then you're sleeping in the tent and not in the sukkah. Kiman ki Rabbi Yehuda damar lo ate oal arai muvatel oal keva. It must be, he holds like Rabbi Yehuda. What did Rabbi Yehuda say? An oal arai, a temporary tent, does not come and cancel out your oal keva. Remember we said that Rabbi Yehuda, he says the sukkah can be 10, 20 amot tall. He must hold, that was what Abai connected all those opinions and said he must hold that a sukkah is a dirat keva. If it's a dirat keva and then you have this temporary tent inside your permanent structure, that's not going to have any effect on anything. You're not really sleeping in your tent. You're sleeping in your permanent sukkah. Ditnan, how do we know that Rabbi Yehuda holds this? Because I'm a Rabbi Yehuda, no agima yinu lishan tachanamita. He says we used to sleep under the beds. Okay, now you think about, maybe it was, there were a lot of kids, not enough room in the sukkah, so the kids used to creep under the beds. That was where they slept, in the sukkah. So he says we used to sleep under the bed, bifnaz kenim, in front of this kenim. In other words, we all slept in the same sukkah, but we would go under the beds. Okay, so because of that, if you're under the bed, now the bed itself functions like a tent. So how could you sleep under a bed? It's the same thing as sleeping in the bed with a tent over, right? Or maybe it is, maybe it's not. We'll see. So now they say, if the whole idea is that he holds like Rabbi Yehuda, and that's what Rabbi Bar Rav Huna was saying, that when he said you could sleep in this kilah, even though it has a roof, and right, even if it's 10 tall, because I don't think that an oal arai, a temporary tent, can override this oal keva, the sukkah that you're sleeping in. So lema halachak Rabbi Yehuda, we should say that halach is like Rabbi Yehuda. Then you should just simply say I hold like Rabbi Yehuda. Why did he have to give this example? Would have been much smarter to say I hold by this opinion. So iyamar halachak Rabbi Yehuda, we're going to say no. If you said halach like Rabbi Yehuda, hava amina hanimila mita. Rabbi Yehuda only talked about a bed. He didn't talk about this canopy over your bed. So you might have thought he only said you could sleep under the bed because mita diligaba asuya. A mita, a bed, was never meant to be a tent. The fact that you were sleeping under it, the bed is meant for sleeping on top of, not under it. The fact that you use it sleeping under it, the bed maybe wouldn't be called an ohel, a tent. Aval kila dilitocha asuya, but a kila is built for the inside. This kila is meant for you to have a canopy over you, a tent over you. Maybe Emalo, maybe Rabbi Yehuda would say in that case, this really does count as a tent, and it really is, you are nullifying your sukkah. You're basically sleeping in a tent and not your sukkah. Therefore, Kamash Malan, Tama de Rabbi Yehuda, Dilo Ate Olarai Mavatalo, Keva Loshna Mitava Loshna Kila. That's why he had to give this specific example, because he wanted to tell you that Rabbi Yehuda really thinks that this is not a problem no matter what. That really, when he said I slept under the bed, doesn't necessarily mean that no oel keva can come and cancel this oel arai. No oel arai, no temporary oel can cancel my sukkah keva. You might not have thought he thought that if he just gave you the bed example. Therefore, he taught, Rabbi Bar Rav Huna taught us this specific halacha. Even in a kila, Rabbi Yehuda would agree that no tent cancels out your sukkah, which is a permanent, temporary serious structure, does not get canceled out by some tent that you put in, whether it's under a bed or whether it's over the bed in this kila, in this canopy. Okay, new Mishnah, and it's a Mishnah we just saw mentioned in the previous daf. Hidla aleha et hagefen ve'et hadlat ve'et hakisus v'sikech al gaba psula. If you drape across the top of your sukkah a vine, some sort of vine, whether it's a grapevine or from the gourds or from the kisus, which is some other type of tree, vine, some other type of vine plant, and sikech al gaba, and then you put schach on top of that, psula. It's no good because you have this pasol schach, it's attached to the ground. Ve'im haya sikuch harbe mehen, but if the schach, the kosher schach, was much greater than this other schach, which remember we learned that's like bishach haftan, they're mixed, they're intertwined, so one can nullify the other, laws of rov, of majority, kitzitzan, or you just cut them. Okay, you put the vines over your sukkah and then you cut them. Okay, then kshera, it works. Ze'aklal, this is the rule about schach. Kol shehu makabel tuma ve'ein gidulo min haaretz ein mesachachim bo. Anything that is susceptible to impurity or doesn't grow from the ground, You can't use this as schach. We're going to learn later where they get this from. Anything that doesn't accept impurity and grows from the ground, you can use this as schach. So now, what's the problem? The problem is this isn't makabel tuma when it's attached to this. It's right. This is just telling you the rules, right? This isn't necessarily related to what we were just saying, but like, let's say, here's an example. Let's say you took leather. You could have put leather on because that's not gidul min haaretz, okay? So you need basically those two criteria. Now we're going to get back to this idea about putting the stuff on and then we cut them. Okay, we're going to see all sorts of interesting things about it. This all is based, okay, and this sounds difficult according to the opinion. You have to build a sukkah, and the drasha is ta'aseh v'lo min ha'asui. You have to build it yourself and not take it from something that's already in existence. That means, like, for example, we talked about the tree hanging over. You can't use something that's in a tree, right, which is just like this case, and use it as your schach. It has to be that you put the stuff on top of the sukkah. So this sounds a little bit difficult because here they say if you cut it, then it's okay. So how that works, we're going to get into that, try to figure out. So Yativ Rav Yosef Kamei Rav Huna v'Yativ Ka'am. We're going to try to figure out what does it mean that you have to make it yourself. Okay, what exactly is defined by I did this myself and not that I took something that was already in existence. And by the way, when we talk about ta'aseh v'lo min ha'asui, one thing that's really important to clarify is that we always mean the schach and not the walls. The walls, you can use your house walls. You don't have to build the walls of the sukkah. You only have to build the schach. That's why people have pergolas. Some people build pergolas that you can take out the pieces and put them back in. That's so that you can use this concept of ta'aseh v'lo min ha'asui. By the way, thinking of pergolas, I wanted to point out the sukkah al gabe sukkah that we were talking about in yesterday's daf and the previous. People ask, like, how could the sukkah possibly be the top sukkah? What's it standing on? You know, schach is not stable, but you could use something wood, right? Like something that's solid. You could actually have like a lattice type of structure made up of your schach that could be more solid and stationary. That's possible, like a pergola. Okay, so that's a way to understand that case. Okay, moving on to the Gemara now. Yativ Rav Yosef Kamei Rav Huna v'Yativ Kamar. So Rav Yosef was sitting in front of Rav Huna and he said the following. O shekitzitzang shera. Okay, he said, the Mishnah said, you can cut it and it'll be kshera. V'amar Rav, but Rav said, tzarich lena'aneh. You need to move it a little. You can't just take something that was existing, cut it, and say that that's sufficient. That's not ta'aseh. You have to actually move it, right? Pick up the schach, put it down, like I said about the pergola. Amar le Rav Huna. Rav Huna says to him, Shmuel amara. What are you talking about? Shmuel said that. Hadrini Rav Yosef la'ape. Rav Yosef turned around to look at him, and he said, Va'amar le atu mi kamin alach to lo amar Shmuel. And that's Rav Yosef said that Rav said this, and Rav Huna said, but Shmuel said it. So Rav Yosef understood him saying as Shmuel also said it. And what he said is, did I tell you Shmuel didn't say it? Amar Rav, Amar Shmuel. I said Rav said it, but also Shmuel said it. I wasn't saying Shmuel didn't say this. I didn't say anything about Shmuel. It's not like I disagree with you. Amar le Rav Huna, hachi kamin alach. Rav Huna says to him, no. This is what I was trying to tell you. You misunderstood me. Did Shmuel Amar Rav lo Rav? What you just said about moving it, only Shmuel thinks that. Rav does not think that you have to move it at all. Rav says it's totally fine. All you have to do is cut it. He views ta'aseh v'lo min ha'asui. What is ta'aseh? Cutting it is sufficient to be considered that you did it. You did something because you cut. That was an action. That's sufficient. Okay? Putting it on, right? If it's already there, that's a problem. But if you cut it, you're doing an action. Shmuel says that's not enough. You actually have to move the schach. It's an interesting discussion about what is ta'aseh mean, and that's what the Gemara is going to get into now. So how do I know that Rav said it's okay? And now he's going to bring him a case from tzitzit, which also have to be done, and you have to create them and not take it from something that's already existing. We saw that before with the threads that were hanging out, but you can't use those for your tzitzit. Rav Amram Chasida, Ramet Chelta lePerzume de'in shebete. He put the tchelet, which is the strings, he put into the perzuma, the clothing of in shebete. Very interesting source here. I'm going to read Rashi. can't miss this Rashi. Presuming de inche bete. That means the clothing of the people in his house. But bete often means wife. And here it says, litalit ishto, for the tzitzit of his wife. His wife had tzitzit. Fascinating, right? Generally, we say women are not obligated in tzitzit. And, there's even a question, are women allowed to if they want to? Anyway, but it's not so generally practiced, but there are people who do. It says here, the kasavar, he held Lila's man tzitzitu. He thought that women were actually obligated. Forget about could they do it if they wanted to. He thought they were obligated because he said that tefillin could be worn also at night. There's a debate. I'm sorry, not tefillin. My confusion. Tzitzit, not to be confused with tefillin. Whole different topic. But he says, Lila's man tzitzitu. Uri itemoto. Now it says, and you should see the tzitzit. That's why most people say you don't wear them at night. But he said, prat lichsut suma. It's to exclude the clothing of someone who can't see their own clothing, meaning a blind person. Avaksut laila, but if you have pajamas, clothing you wear at night, specifically chayav, if you're obligated at night, then it's not time-bound mitzvah. It's a mitzvah all the time to wear tzitzit. And therefore, nashim would be chayavot. Women would be obligated. He held that way, and that's why he did this. He threaded through. Now, that whole issue wasn't really the topic about tzitzit and women, but it was interesting, so I brought it up. But now, what did he do? He put the tchelet, the strings, through the perzuma, the inshe bete, to la'an velo pasak rashi chutin shelen. He put in the strings. He folded them. Here we actually have the pictures. Let's pull them up. He folded them over. Okay, he put them through. See, there's 4 strings here and 4 strings there on picture number 64. And he took one string and he threaded it through a number of times, made loops. But there really aren't 8 strings here, right? You need 8 strings before you tie them, but he didn't do that. What did he do? The lo, right? So lo pasak rashi chutin shalahen, and then he tied them. Okay, then he did all the knots of the tzitzit. Okay, we're not going to see the next picture yet. Then he did the knots after that. Ata the kameder of Chiur bar Ashi, Amar le, hachi amarav mifas kan vehem kshirin. They brought in front of Rav Chiur bar Ashi, and he said, Rav says all you have to do is cut the ends of those strings, and it's good. Even though you already tied, you made all your knots. You did it when it was really not the right way, because it was 1 string rather than 8 strings. But Rav says all you have to do is cut it, vehem kshirin. So therefore, Alma psikatan zoi asiyatan. Psikatan is the asiyah. Cutting it is sufficient, just like cutting it with the vine would be sufficient. Hachanami, likewise here, ksitatan zoi asiyatan. Cutting the branches would work. So now we're going to have, so we see Rav says that's okay. Shmuel says it's not. This is Rav Huna's reading of things. And now we're going to start questioning Rav and Shmuel. First, starting with a question on Shmuel. V'hatani Shmuel mishum Rabbi Chia. Hitil l'shnei kranot bevat achat. We're back to tzitzit now. Okay, we're now questioning the tzitzit case of Shmuel. Shmuel says, and here's another picture, if you hitil shnei kranot bevat achat, you put into 2 corners, you took 1 string, and again you made it, twisted it around a few times, you looped it and made 1 string into many, but you put it through, you had a very long string and you put it through 2 of the corners. Okay. So you strung it through, and then you cut the ends. Okay, so now they say you said it was okay, Shmuel. How could you say that's okay? My love, now first they assume that what happened here. You then, before you cut everything, now I don't know how exactly you could do this because it would be almost impossible, but somehow you made the knots while they were all attached to this 1 big string. And then you cut it. So that would be taset, right? That would be exactly like Rav says, which is you can tie it and then you can tie the knots in the tzitzit and then you can cut it. To which he says, lo, my lav shekosher v'achar kach pasek. First they thought that they tied the knots and then cut it, which would be Rav. And that would go against Shmuel. Then they say, lo, shepasek v'achar kach kosher. No. There's 3 stages. One is threading it through. The next is tying the knots. And the third is cutting them. When did you do each? So first you threaded, then you cut, then you did the knots. So it is taseh v'lo manasoi because you did the knots when it was no longer connected. That's not the same as Rav, who says you can actually tie the knots and only cut the strings after that. Because again, Rav thinks taseh, right, is cutting is enough. So now they said, right, losh posek v'acharka kosher posek. Okay, so now, if you cut it and then tied it, well, obviously that should work too, which the Gemara asks, posek v'acharka kosher ma'ila meimra. That's obvious that, of course, who cares whether you threaded it as one? The main important thing is the tying the knots. So obviously, if you cut it before you tied the knots, and then they were individual strings at that point, right? That's, the fact that you took one string and turned it into many strings by cutting it, of course, that's okay. We always do that. It always starts off as one string and then you cut it. So ma'u detema, you might have thought, what might you have thought? You might have thought, be'inan kanaf bishat ptil v'leika. What is this? It says in Parshat Tzitzi, "V'natnuat tzitzita kanaf b'til tchelet." You have to put a b'til tchelet into the corner. So it says it in singular, even though it's four corners of the cloth. So you might have thought that you need to have it only, that the threading is important, thread it through on one corner at a time. V'leika, and you don't have that here. Kamash malan, that's what Shmuel was teaching us, that it's okay and you don't need it. Now we're going to start with questions on Rav. So that was the question on Shmuel, now questions on Rav. We're still on tzitzi. You hung them in, but you didn't cut the ends of the strings. Psulin, it's no good. My lab psulin lo'olam, it sounds like you're never going to have good tzitzit on that one. You messed it up. And to Rav, and that would be a question on Rav. So Amar Lecha Rav, what would Rav say? My psulin achi pasku. No, they're disqualified until you cut the string. Just cut the string and then you can resolve. Ushmuel Amar psulin la'olam. Shmuel says though, right, which makes sense according to Shmuel, that these will never be good. V'chein Amar Levi also said psulin la'olam. V'chein Amar Rav Matna Amar Shmuel psulin la'olam. Also Rav Matna said in the name of Shmuel that they're disqualified forever. Ikad Amri, some people say that Rav Matna actually came a little bit differently. Amar Rav Matna, bididi hava uvda. I had a case like this, va'ate l'kamei Amar Shmuel, and I brought it in front of Shmuel. Va'amar li psulin la'olam. Not that he said that Shmuel said this, but he actually had a case and he brought it before Shmuel, and Shmuel told him it was no good. That was the first question on Shmuel, Rav, and then we got to Shmuel's disagreeing with that they'll be disqualified forever. And now we're going to have another question on Rav. If you put them, threaded them through, then you cut them, psulin, they're disqualified. Ve'od, and additionally, Tanya gabe Sukkah, okay, so the first question is, you thread them through and then you cut them, they're disqualified. That goes against Rav clearly, right? And in addition, there's a braita by Sukkah to aseh v'lo menasui. Mikan amru, okay, that's the halacha I was telling you. You have to make it and not from things that are already made. Mikan amru, from there they learned hidla ala et hagefen, betzitla et hakisus, exactly the case that we're talking about. V'sikech al gabam psula, right? And then you put schach on top, it's disqualified. Hechidami, what's the case here? Let's try to figure out the case where you put it on and it's no good. If you didn't cut them, that if you say they're still attached to the ground, it's a separate problem. They can't be attached to the ground. That's a separate problem in and of itself. It's not because it's because you can't use for schach anything that's attached to the ground. So therefore, it can't possibly be they're talking about vine that's attached to the ground, because if it were attached to the ground, they would say it was mechubarin. It's attached, and not that it's a problem of ta'aseh v'lo menasui, that you have to make it yourself. There's a separate disqualification. Ela b'shekitzitsan. So it must be, because it didn't say you can't use them because they're attached. It must be they're detached. B'katani psula. It must mean you, even if you cut them, they're still disqualified. So v'shmamina delo ambrinan k'tzitzatan zoi asiyatan. And it sounds like we don't say like you said, Rav did, which is cutting it is enough to say I did something. B'tiyuvta d'Rav. So what's Rav going to say? Right, tiyuvta means this is a serious difficulty with Rav. Amar lecha Rav. Rav would answer hacha b'mayaskinan d'shalfinu shelufe d'lo minkara asiyadidhu. Rav's going to distinguish between cutting them with scissors or something significant and pulling them so that they detach. If you pull them and they detach, it's not really a noticeable action. In which case, you can't call that ta'aseh v'lo menasui. He said you can cut them, and that works to say I did something. It's only if you cut them with utensils, properly cut them. But if you just pull them and they detach, that's not considered ta'aseh v'lo menasui. And therefore, they say this braita that was saying that doesn't work would have to mean that you pull them and they were no longer attached. That's the first. Okay, now we brought two brightot here to contradict Rav. This only dealt with the second brightot. But now they're going to say mikomakom, but what about the first one? Tila'am v'achar kach pasak. And then they say kasha l'Rav kasha. That really is difficult because it seems to say you have to even thread them through, and it's going to be a problem because, right, if you do that, really this is a difficulty. Now they say lema kitanai. Why don't we suggest this machloket Rav and Shmuel about how we fulfill ta'aseh v'lo manasui is a machloket tanaim. What's the machloket? It says avar v'liktan. Okay, you need some background. Hadassim, the myrtle branches, actually grow with berries. And you can actually use them if they have berries, as long as the berries are not greater than the amount of leaves that you have. We don't have them with berries anymore. But what if you didn't take off the berries and you have too many berries and it's yantif now? And you're not allowed to pick the berries off on yantif, even though they're detached. Theoretically, you could, right? Like you eat grapes, you could pull them off from there. That's fine. But here you're fixing something. Mitaken. You're not allowed to do mitaken. That's from makeh patish. It's the last malacha on Shabbat, which is, final blow to an action. You're making something usable, something that wasn't usable before. So you can't do that on yantif. What if you did anyway? Avar v'liktan, pasul. Your four minim, the four things, the lulav, etrog, hadassim, and aravot, are no good. Divrei Rabbi Shimon ben Yotzadaq. V'chachamim machshirim. The rabbis say it's okay. What's the source of their machloket? Savrua, they thought that kule amalulav tzarech eged. Everybody thinks, we're going to have a debate about this, but both these opinions think the lulav has to be bound. When we say lulav here, we mean the four species. They all need to be bound together. V'yalfinan lulav misukkah. And then, if they need to be bound, then we have this concept that when you bind them, right, that's ta'aseh v'lo manasui. You have to create them when they're ready to go, right? Like this is exactly the issue. So they have to be ready to go when you bind them, or can you fix it later? And that's also considered ta'aseh. So if you hold lulav tzarich eged, and then you say we learn lulav from Sukkah, dichtiv gabei Sukkah ta'aseh v'lo manasui, and therefore we're going to learn whatever's true for Sukkah will be true for these also, and that you also have a deen that these have to be created properly and not something that's already ready. My lava can be flugay. So now, what would be the root of the machloket? Timan de Shiur, the one who says this is okay, savar amrinan gabei Sukkah ksitzatan zo yasiyatan. V'gabei lulav nami amrinan l'kitatan zo yasiyatan. You're creating it when you pick it off. Now, even though it's yantif, you shouldn't have done it, but you did. You pulled off those berries. You now created it, and it's properly done. Uman de pasil savar lo amrinan gabei Sukkah ksitzatan zo yasiyatan. V'gabei lulav nami lo amrinan l'kitatan zo yasiyatan. And the one who says it doesn't work is saying like Shmuel. It doesn't work by Sukkah to cut it, and likewise, it doesn't work by lulav to cut it. When you did the eged from the beginning, it had to be properly done then. Just like when you put the schach on, it has to be properly done then, and not that you can cut it after and say, oh, now it's done. This is my action of doing it. So isn't that the machloket, right? And then, so again, lulav nami lo amrinan, so you wouldn't say by lulav either. So then the Gemara, and then it would be the machloket Rav and Shmuel. Gemara says, nobody, let's assume that everybody holds like Shmuel here. You cannot do it by Sukkah. There we assumed everybody agrees you learn lulav from Sukkah. Here we're going to say, no. The debate is, do you learn lulav from Sukkah? Does lulav have those same criteria or not? Right? Sukkah has that criteria, you can't just cut it. But lulav maybe would, maybe wouldn't. The one who says it's okay says we don't learn. That's the rabbis. We don't learn lulav from Sukkah. Lulav doesn't have the same criteria. And again, we say lulav, we mean also hadassim, all of the different four species. Uman de pasil saval yafina lulav misukkah. The one who disqualifies says we do learn lulav from Sukkah. That's one way to look at it. V'ibait ema, an alternative is isfir alandu lulav tzarich eged. Now we're gonna. That was all based on an assumption that lulav needs eged. Now we're going to say maybe that's the machloket. If you say lulav needs eged, it needs to be bound together, all of them. Then obviously you'll have to learn lulav from Sukkah because igud is some action. You need to do it. You need to bind them when everything's perfect, right? Not pick them off after. But the debate is, does it even need eged? If it doesn't even need eged, and you just use these 4 species and they don't need to be bound together, then of course it doesn't really matter if they were ready before or they're ready now. It makes no difference. And then we're actually going to show that there's a whole Tanaitic debate. Do they need eged or not? There's another one of those cases where something we take for granted, they all have to be bound together, isn't necessarily the case. Ditanya, lulav bein agud bein she'eno agud kasher. Whether it's bound, whether it's not bound, it's good. Rabbi Yehuda omer agud kasher she'eno agud pasul. If it's bound, it's good. If it's not bound, it's not good. My time to Rabbi Yehuda. What's the reason for Rabbi Yehuda who says agud kasher, but eno agud is no good? Yalef lekicha me agudat ezov. By the agudat ezov, okay, which the Jews were commanded in Egypt to take an agudat ezov and dip it in the blood of the korban and then put it on the doorpost. Remember all the blood on the doorpost? They used an agudat ezov. Now agudat ezov, agudah means to bind it, right? You tie the hyssop branch, right? You bind it with other things. That's the agudat ezov. And it says there, ulekachtem agudat ezov. Uchtiv hacha velekachtem lachem bayom harishon. Ulekachtem zera shava. Therefore, malahalam ba'aguda, af kan nami ba'aguda. The Rabbanan say, no, likicha lo yafina. They don't have a tradition about Gzera Shava like that. Gzera Shava is, if you remember, we take 2 words and we say it's true for one, it's true for the other. It only goes by tradition. They didn't have a tradition about it, so they didn't learn that. Kimanaz lahaz. So wait, if we have this machloket, lulav needs eged or doesn't need eged. So according to who is the following source? Hadetanya lulav mitzvah le'ogdo. It's a mitzvah to do, but if you didn't, it's okay. Doesn't seem to match either opinion. Rabbi Yehuda, kilo agdo amai kasher. If it's Rabbi Yehuda, if you didn't bind it, why would it be good? The Rabbanan amai mitzvah. And according to the rabbis, it doesn't need igud. Why would you need to do it at all? Why would it be a mitzvah, like a good thing to do? So what do they answer? La'olam Rabbanan hi umishum shenemar ze'ili v'amveu hidna elefanav b'mitzvot. It's much nicer, right? Things are more organized when they're bound together and not when it's all over the place. So therefore, right, imagine if you took in your hand the aravot and the hadassim and you held it kind of next to the lulav, it would be, right, already it's a little messy. They start falling over. But all the more so if they weren't bound together. So according to, even though he says you don't have to, it's still nicer to, because it's nicer to, you should glorify God. This is part of glorifying God by having it more organized. Zakla. Okay, back to the Mishnah. Now we're going to start learning. There's going to be a number of sources for this. We're only going to see the first one today. Where do we get that it has to be davar hamakabel tum'ah is no good for schach? It has to be something that's not makabel tum'ah and that grows from the ground, not susceptible to impurity and grows from the ground. First answer. Okay, this is a pasuk in Sefer Bereshit, which describes in the creation of the world, and it said this mist came up from the ground. The mist is kind of like a cloud. We'll get to what the connection with cloud is. In aid is something that doesn't have, it's not susceptible to impurity, but it comes from the ground. Likewise, sukkah is something that's not makabel tumah and comes from the ground. Okay, we get it from there. So now they say, what's the connection to aid and a cloud kind of thing and sukkah? Oh, well, that all works if you say that the sukkah is remembering that God had these clouds that protected us in the desert. We're going to talk about this machloket in a minute. It's a very, very central machloket about the purpose of the sukkah. But if you really mean physical booths, that right, when we say keep a sukkot shavti b'nei Israel, there's a big debate. Do we mean God protected us by having these clouds surrounding the camp protecting us? Or does it mean actual physical sukkot? If you say it's clouds, then this connection to the aid is a perfect connection. If you say it's actual sukkot, this aid has nothing to do with anything. Remember, aid is a mist. So what can you say? Ditanya. Now, how do we know there's a machloket about this? It says in a braita, Ki b'sukkot shavti b'nei Israel, ananei kavod hayu divrei Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Akiva omer sukkot mamash asu lahem, and that's the debate between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. Was it real sukkot or was it anani? So hani chala Rabbi Eliezer. So his opinion makes sense with the aid. But Ela Rabbi Akiva ma'ika l'meimar. What can you say? And then we're going to stop here. We'll start tomorrow with Rav Dimi and his opinion, which is a different opinion, and we'll get to that tomorrow. Som Kal, if you're listening to this before, or post Som if not, and we'll meet up tomorrow.